Good morning and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Suddhāso and I'll be speaking a bit about another discourse this morning. So we'll start with paying homage to the Buddha and then I'll read through the discourse and then take any questions at the end. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. So this morning we'll be looking at a discourse from the Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 6, sutta number 42. This is called the Nagita Sutta. Which is a discourse that the Buddha gave to his attendant at the time, who was named Nagita. So I'll read through the discourse and you feel free to type in questions at any time. And once I'm done with going through the sutta and giving some explanation, then I'll take any questions. So the sutta begins. At one time, the Buddha was wandering in the land of the Kosalans together with a large community of monks when he arrived at the village of the Kosalan Brahmins named Ichanangala, and he stayed in a forest nearby. And the people of Ichanangala heard, it seems the contemplative Gotama, a Sakyan from the Sakyan family, has arrived at Ichanangala and is staying in a forest nearby, and he has this good reputation. And what they've heard is that the Buddha is an arhat, a fully awakened being, accomplished in knowledge and conduct, sublime, one who understands the world, supreme teacher of those who can be trained, teacher of gods and humans. So someone, basically the standard recollection of the Buddha. Itipiso bhagava arahang samma sambuddho, etc. And continues, they had heard that the Buddha has realized with his own insight this world, with its gods, Maras and Brahmas, with ascetics and Brahmins, gods and humans, and he makes it known to others. In other words, that the Buddha has a full understanding of the nature of reality, and he also teaches it to other people. And also they had heard the Buddha teaches Dhamma that's good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end. Meaningful and well phrased, and explains a spiritual practice that's entirely complete and pure. And they conclude, it's good to see such arhats, such worthy people. So they've heard that the Buddha was enlightened, and this was something which started spreading. So shortly after the Buddha attained awakening and began teaching people, he very quickly started to gain a reputation, and people started spreading stories of this incredible spiritual teacher which had appeared in northern India. People started spreading stories all over the region. And so then in the very beginning, when the Buddha was traveling around, at first people didn't know him. They didn't know who he was or what he was doing. But as he started to teach in different places, then soon word spread. And when he would go to places, people had already heard of him. And often they were already waiting for an opportunity to see him. So this is what happened in this case. The people in this town of Ichanangala had already heard about the Buddha and were already looking forward to an opportunity to meet the Buddha and to have some encounter with him. So the sutta continues. Then when the night had passed, they took a variety of foods and went to the forest near Ichanangala, where they stood outside the gates, making a lot of noise. So they're bringing food to offer to the Buddha, but they're doing so in a very noisy way. And the sutta continues. At that time, Venerable Nagita was the Buddha's attendant. Then the Buddha said to Nagita, Nagita, who is making that dreadful racket? Who's making all that noise? He says, you'd think it was fishermen hauling in a catch. And Nagita replies, Bhante, it's these Brahmins and householders of Ichanangala. They've brought a variety of food and they're standing outside the gates, wanting to offer it specially to the Buddha and to the community of monks. And the Buddha replies, Nagita, may I never become famous. May fame not come to me. There are those who cannot get the pleasure of renunciation, the pleasure of seclusion, the pleasure of peace, the pleasure of awakening when they want, without trouble or difficulty, like I can. Let them enjoy the filthy pleasure of possessions, honor, and popularity. So this is the central teaching of this discourse here. So the discourse continues, and I'll go on with it after this. But the central teaching here is this. It's indicating that what we're aiming at, the kind of happiness that we're aiming at, is the happiness of renunciation, the happiness of seclusion, the happiness of peacefulness, of inner peace, the happiness of awakening. Whereas if one is constantly surrounded by noisy, busy, fawning followers, if everywhere one goes, one is constantly surrounded by an entourage, always crowds of people coming to see you, well, then your life will not be peaceful. Your life will not be serene. It will constantly be filled with busyness and noise. And part of the big problem here is that when one is constantly bombarded with praise, honor, fame, and offerings, then one can easily become arrogant. One can easily become egotistic, self-centered. And also one's desires and attachments can become inflamed. When you can get what you want whenever you want it, then what actually tends to happen is you just want even more, just constantly chasing one's desires. So the Buddha here is pointing to the fact that so fame, honor, gain, popularity, these are all things which they do have a certain amount of pleasure to them, but it's nowhere near the pleasure of a well-developed spiritual practice. And in fact, if one is bombarded with fame and wealth, then it will tend to be an impediment to one's spiritual growth. It will tend to hold one back. So this is actually not a problem for the Buddha himself. So the Buddha at this point was already fully awakened and had already been fully awakened for a long time. So he had no concern with anything obstructing his own spiritual practice. So why was he so opposed? And actually the main reason he was so opposed was as a message for his followers. It was a way of looking out for his followers, making sure that his followers were not swept up in the harmful, poisonous effects of too much fame, too much popularity, too much wealth. And also making sure that they understood that this was not the purpose of the spiritual life. In fact, it was something which was antithetical to a good spiritual life. However, Nagita did not get the point, so the Buddha's attendant Nagita then says, Bhante, may the Blessed One please relent now. May the Holy One relent. Now is the time for the Buddha to relent. Relent is a bit of an odd translation. Accept would be a better word. So in other words, he's saying, no, the Buddha should accept these offerings. He should accept this fame, this praise. He should accept these donations. And Nagita continues, wherever the Buddha now goes, the Brahmins and householders will go the same way, as will the people of the town and country. Like when it rains heavily and the water flows downhill. In the same way, wherever the Buddha goes, the Brahmins and householders will go the same way, as will the people of town and country. Why is that? Because of the Buddha's morality and wisdom. So Nagita here he's trying to encourage the Buddha to, just go with it. Accept that he's becoming famous and collecting this huge following, and just accept that wherever he's going, he'll be surrounded by this huge following. But the Buddha, first off, the Buddha repeats once again, he says, may I never become famous. May fame not come to me. And again, he says, there are those who cannot get the pleasure of renunciation, the pleasure of seclusion, the pleasure of peace, the pleasure of awakening whenever they want, without trouble or difficulty, like I can. And let them enjoy the filthy pleasure of possessions, honor, and popularity. And then the Buddha gives a bit more explanation here. He says, take a monk living within a village who I see sitting immersed in samadhi, so in concentrated meditation. The Buddha says, I think to myself, now a monastery attendant, a novice, or a fellow practitioner will make this venerable fall from concentration. And he says, so I am not pleased with that monk living within a village. In other words, the Buddha is saying, yes, when one is surrounded by people, surrounded by activities, it is possible to do some meditation practice, but there will always be distractions. There will always be interruptions. So again, think of a famous celebrity walking through a city. There's always people coming up to them and wanting autographs and wanting to ask them questions, and there's never a moment's peace. Well, in the same way, if one is famous and well-known, then there's always a stream of people coming to see you. So I remember recently we were in Italy, and we had gone to see this little, used to be a small hermitage many, many years ago, long since abandoned. But we went to see it, and the locals told us, oh, there used to be a little group of monks living here, Catholic monks living here. But after they had lived here for a little while, the locals started to think, oh, there's these amazing saints living close by. We should go and visit them and bring them offerings and ask them for advice. And so after a little while, the monks got up and left. And they moved to a different place, a different hermitage, a bit more remote and secluded. And they stayed there for a while until eventually the locals there figured out, oh, there's these amazing saintly monks staying nearby. We should go and visit them and ask them questions. And then the monks left again, and they moved to another hermitage, even more remote. And once again, after a little while, the locals figured out, oh, there's these great monks nearby. We should go and visit them and ask questions. And so it was this progression of these poor monks just wanting to live a quiet, peaceful, contemplative life. But everywhere they went, fame and honor and wealth was chasing them. So it was difficult to find a sufficiently peaceful and secluded place to do their practice. Because again, there's always people coming to see you and talk to you and ask questions and wanting this from you and wanting you to chant blessings for them and wanting you to do ceremonies for them. And when you're constantly bombarded with this kind of thing, then it's hard to train the mind. So once the mind is fully trained, once one is fully awakened, then these things are no longer a problem. But during the training process, it's important to have a certain degree of seclusion, a certain degree of isolation, a certain degree of solitude, in order to properly develop the mind. So the Buddha continues, he says, and there could be a monk in the wilderness who I see sitting, falling asleep during meditation. So not so inspiring here. But the Buddha says, I think to myself, now this venerable, after they have dispelled that sleepiness and drowsiness, will focus on the unified perception of wilderness. In other words, he's saying that, okay, yeah, this person right now, their meditation is not going so well, but because they're living a quiet, peaceful, secluded life in the forest, in the wilderness, then they have good conditions, which will make it so that their meditation will improve. So whereas the famous, well-honored monk in the town, they might start off with good meditation, but because they're surrounded with so much distraction and busyness, it will tend to weaken their practice over time. Whereas the monk who's living in the forest, they may start off with weak meditation, but because they're living in such supportive, conducive surroundings, it will tend to support the growth of their meditation practice over time. And so the Buddha continues, he says, I am pleased with the monk that is living in the wilderness. And he says, now take a monk in the wilderness who I see sitting without being immersed in samadhi. So in other words, they're doing meditation practice, and they're not falling asleep anymore, but they're also not getting into deep concentration. And the Buddha says, I think to myself, now if this venerable's mind is not immersed in samadhi, they will immerse it. Or if it is immersed in samadhi, they will preserve it. In other words, the Buddha is saying, yeah, okay, maybe right now their mind is not well concentrated, but as they continue to practice, their concentration will improve. And this is, again, because they're living in a secluded, quiet place where they have the opportunity to focus on developing their meditation practice without the distraction of popularity and wealth. And then the Buddha says, take a monk who's in the wilderness, sitting immersed in samadhi. So this is someone who actually is in good concentration. And he says, now this venerable will free the unfreed mind, or maintain the freed mind. In other words, this person will liberate their mind from the defilements, from greed, hatred, and delusion. So now that they're in supportive conditions for meditation, their concentration is strong, now they can bring the mind to full awakening. And he says, so I am pleased with that monk that is living in the wilderness. And then he goes back to criticizing the more lazy monks. He says, take a monk who I see living within a village, receiving robes, alms food, lodgings, and medicines and supplies, enjoying possessions, honor, and popularity. They neglect retreat, and they neglect remote lodgings in the wilderness and forest. They come down to villages, towns, and cities and make their home there. So I am not pleased with that monk that is living within the village. So again, here he's saying, he's pointing to the fact that when one is focused on wealth and popularity, rather than on cultivating one's spiritual practice, then one will tend to gravitate towards living in busy places. So again, towns and cities, where it's much easier. It's much easier to get nice things. It's much easier to have access to fawning followers. It's much easier to get whatever you want, except for a good meditation practice. It's very hard to cultivate a good meditation practice when one is surrounded by adoring followers in the middle of a city. It's not particularly good for one's practice. But then he says, take a monk who I see in the wilderness, receiving robes, alms food, lodgings, and medicines for the sick. Fending off possessions, honor, and popularity, they do not neglect retreat, and they do not neglect remote dwellings in the wilderness and the forest. So this is still the case of someone who is receiving their basic needs, but their focus is on retreat. Their focus is on taking the opportunity to practice in seclusion, practice in solitude, to seek out ideal conditions for cultivating their meditation practice. So this is something quite different from the person who instead is seeking out supportive conditions for the acquisition of wealth and honor and popularity. And then the Buddha ends with this statement. He says, Nagita, when I'm walking along a road and I don't see anyone ahead of me or behind me, I feel comfortable, even if I need to urinate or defecate. So what the Buddha is saying here is he's pointing to the basic pleasure of solitude, of seeking happiness just in being alone, of finding comfort and joy in being alone. And then the opportunity that gives for the cultivation of a peaceful and introspective mind. So that's the end of this discourse. So at this time, we can respect the sutta with 3 sadhus, and then I'll take any questions there might be. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And hello to all the people joining in online. Hello to Rebecca, Jay, Jerry, Ned, Manal, Tora, Matthias, Karuna, Jerry, Sud, Bhumika, Yankee, Amarante, and Patricia. Welcome, all of you. And I see here, Jerry says, I've heard that knower of the world refers to the sixth sense media as the world. Please confirm this understanding or correct me. I mean, the Buddha does sometimes, in some places, he says that by the world, he means our experience of the six senses. But that's because that's how we experience the world. We experience the world through our six senses. So that's one way that one can talk about the world. So that's referring back to subjective experience as being the base of our relationship to reality. But when it talks about the Buddha as being the knower of the world, what this means is someone who clearly understands the nature of reality. So that does include understanding how the six senses work, but it's a more profound statement than that. It's understanding how reality operates, how causality operates, so that one is not confused or caught off guard by anything. And Sud says, do you think Silanussati would predispose one to falling into the trap of praise and thereby creating a false sense of self based on praiseworthiness? So Silanussati, the recollection of one's own goodness, one's own morality, would it predispose one to falling into the trap of praise? Not necessarily. So the trap of praise is when one is constantly seeking praise from others. One is always seeking, some kind of praise or honor or recognition from other people. So Silanussati is not about trying to seek recognition from other people. It's just about knowing within yourself the goodness that you have done, the goodness that you are doing, and appreciating the goodness itself. So recognizing that morality, kindness, generosity, these are impersonal qualities which are in and of themselves good. And we're making an effort to develop and practice those qualities because they are good, because they are spiritually beneficial. So this doesn't necessarily mean that one will fall into the trap of praise, because actually seeking praise on the basis of one's morality is itself an unwholesome activity. So that would be the opposite. So I don't think that recollecting one's own virtue inclines one towards the trap of praise. I don't think so. Matthias says, what is the line at the end of the Pali version of the sutta? Something about Moggallana. No, there's nothing here about Moggallana. No, it's just the line where the Buddha says when he's walking on the road and he doesn't see anyone in front of him or behind him, then he feels comfortable. Yeah, but there's nothing here about Moggallana. And that's the last question. So we can go ahead and conclude it this time with 3 more sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you all next time.